Oakland, California, 1965. The city was hard in the way that port cities are hard, layered, industrial, built on the friction between people who had nothing and people who wanted more. It was not a gentle place. It did not produce gentle stories. And in a modest building on Broadway, in a school with no sign above the door and no advertisement in any newspaper, something was happening that the martial arts world couldn't quite explain. Word was moving through the underground the way dangerous information always moves, quietly, from person to person, carried by fighters who had been in the room and come out different, not beaten in the way that losers are beaten, changed in the way that people are changed when they encounter something that reorders their understanding of what is possible. The school had been open less than a year. Already, they were coming to test it. 12 challengers in 14 months. Not one of them left the same way they arrived. This is the story of the year that forged the legend. Not on a film set, not in a formal tournament, not in a single dramatic confrontation with a single named opponent, but in the accumulated weight of 12 encounters in a bare room in Oakland against men who came with everything they had and found it wasn't enough. Oakland, January 1965. Bruce Lee had moved south from Seattle with Linda and the beginnings of a plan that was larger than the city could contain. The Oakland School, the Junfan Gung Fu Institute, second location, operating out of a space that was functional rather than impressive, was not designed to attract casual students. There was no storefront charm, no colored belts hanging in the window, no beginner's welcome mat. What it had was reputation, and reputation in the martial arts underground of mid-1960s California was the only currency that moved serious people. The reputation had started with the Wong Jack Man fight the previous October, not because Bruce had won. Winning a backroom challenge match was not unusual in those circles, but because of what witnesses reported about the quality of the winning, the speed that didn't fit the available categories, the interception that arrived before the attack had fully formed, the particular stillness of a man who was never where you reached for him. That description traveled, and it attracted a specific kind of listener. Understand who came to Oakland. Not beginners, not curious civilians, not people looking for fitness classes or self-defense basics. The men who came to test Bruce Lee during those 14 months were without exception serious martial artists. Some held black belts in established systems. Some were tournament competitors with regional records. Some were simply men who had fought enough real fights to know the difference between training and truth, and who had heard something about this Chinese instructor in Oakland that didn't fit the story they'd been telling themselves about where the ceiling was. They came for different reasons. Some came because they genuinely wanted to learn, but couldn't bring themselves to simply enroll, couldn't subordinate the ego investment of years of their own training to the position of student without first establishing through a test that the teacher was worth it. Some came because the reputation threatened something, because if what people were saying about Bruce Lee was true, then certain assumptions about style and tradition and the hierarchy of martial arts systems needed to be revised. And revision is uncomfortable, and some people respond to discomfort by attacking its source. Some came simply because they were the best fighter in every room they'd ever entered, and they had heard there was a room where that might not be true, and they needed to know. All of them received the same thing. Not humiliation, not a performance of superiority, not the theatrical dominance of a man who needs to be seen winning. Just the truth, delivered directly, without cruelty and without softening. The first challenger arrived in January. His name was Marcus Webb, not his real name, but the composite of several accounts from that period, because the men who came to test Bruce Lee during those months were rarely interested in being identified afterward. Webb was a judoka, serious one, competed regionally, trained since his teens, the kind of practitioner whose skill was genuine and whose confidence in it was therefore not entirely unjustified. He was also large, 6 feet, 210 pounds, with the grip strength and balance that competitive judo develops in the body over years of actual throwing. He arrived at the school on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't call ahead. That was the pattern. Almost none of them called ahead. They simply appeared, the way people appear when they are doing something they haven't fully decided to do yet and don't want to give themselves time to reconsider. Bruce Lee was in the middle of a training session with 2 students when Webb walked in. He looked up, assessed, continued the session for another 30 seconds, finishing the combination he was demonstrating, before turning to face his visitor. That 30 seconds was its own communication. Webb stated his purpose directly. He'd heard the stories. He wanted to see if they were true. He wasn't looking for trouble. He used those words specifically, not looking for trouble. But he had trained seriously for 11 years, and he wanted to know where he actually stood against someone with this kind of reputation. Bruce Lee listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he nodded.
asked his two students to move to the side of the room, and invited Webb to begin. What followed lasted 4 minutes. Not because it was competitive for 4 minutes, because Bruce Lee spent the first 3.5 minutes letting Webb establish what he had, letting him show his judo, feel the range, attempt the grips and the off-balancing entries that judo used to set up throws, letting him work. This was a pattern that would repeat itself across all 12 encounters, and it was not accidental. It was pedagogical. Bruce Lee was not interested in ending things quickly for the sake of demonstration. He was interested in the other person understanding why what happened, which meant the other person had to first exhaust what they believed in. Webb tried 3 throw attempts in those first 3.5 minutes. None of them found purchase, not because Bruce was dramatically evading, but because the geometry of his position was always slightly wrong for the throw, and the adjustment happened so early and so certainly that Webb couldn't locate the moment it occurred. He was trying to grip water. The 4th attempt, Webb committed fully. The deepest entry, the most total investment of balance and momentum he'd made. Bruce Lee moved in the same direction, not away, not in resistance, but with the momentum, at an angle that Webb's committed weight suddenly had nowhere to go. And in the space that opened, the fraction of a second when Webb's body was between positions, fully invested in a direction that had been redirected, Bruce's elbow arrived at the hinge of Webb's jaw. Stopped just before contact. The touch was light, illustrative. The message was unmistakable.
Webb stood up slowly. He had not fallen. The point had been made without requiring the fall, which was itself a form of respect that Webb recognized because he was experienced enough to recognize it. He stood, adjusted his gi, looked at Bruce Lee with an expression that had traveled a long distance in 4 minutes, from the contained aggression of a rival to something quieter and more open. He said, "How did you know which throw I was setting up?" Bruce Lee smiled, for the first time since Webb had walked in. "I didn't," he said. "I felt where you needed me to be. And I wasn't there." Webb sat down on the bench at the side of the room. He stayed for 2 hours. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. February brought a different kind of visitor. Where Webb had been genuinely curious underneath the challenge, the man who arrived in February, a karate instructor from the East Bay, trained in Shotokan, black belt 3rd Dan, came with something harder in him. He had a school of his own, students who respected him. A system he had taught for 8 years and believed in with the particular faith of someone who has built their professional identity around a thing. The stories about Bruce Lee were not, to this man, an invitation to learn. They were a threat. Because if what people were saying was true, if this Chinese instructor was doing something that made classical karate look incomplete, then the 8 years and the school and the students and the identity were all built on a foundation that needed examining. Some people examine their foundations when they feel them shake. Some people attack the source of the shaking. He didn't frame it as a challenge. He was too smart for that, too experienced in the social dynamics of martial arts communities to walk in and announce himself as a challenger. That would establish a hierarchy he wasn't willing to accept. Instead, he framed it as an exchange, a mutual demonstration, 2 instructors sharing technique, learning from each other, the kind of collegial interaction that the community valued in principle even when it rarely happened in practice. Bruce Lee accepted the framing without comment. They began with basics. The karate man showed his Shotokan, clean, powerful, the kind of technique that has been refined across generations and carries real force. His reverse punch was legitimate. His front kick had the snapping retraction that Shotokan developed specifically to maximize impact and minimize counterattack exposure. He was not pretending. He was showing his real material. Bruce Lee received it, matched it, demonstrated parallel techniques from his own system, genuinely collegial, no performance of superiority. Then the karate man asked to do some light sparring. The word light does a lot of work in martial arts circles. It means different things to different people. To beginners, it means careful. To experienced fighters, it means real but controlled. Real speed, real technique, real intention, with the finishing force modulated so nobody gets hurt. To this particular karate man on this particular afternoon, it meant, now I find out. He came in with his best combination, the one he had thrown 10,000 times in training, the one that had scored in tournaments, the one that his students watched him demonstrate and believed in because they had seen it work. Jab, cross, front kick. The jab found air. The cross was intercepted at the wrist, not blocked, redirected. The force of it turned sideways in a movement so small and so precisely timed that it looked to the 2 students watching from the side like it had simply missed on its own. The front kick never happened, because in the window between the cross and the kick, the window that in normal sparring is occupied by the setup for the next technique, something arrived at the karate man's center line. Not a strike, a placement.
Bruce Lee's lead hand resting against the karate man's sternum with zero force and total precision. The message: I was here. Between your second and bird technique. In the gap you left. I was here, and you didn't know it. The karate man stepped back. His face had done something complicated. The collegial framing, the exchange of equals, the mutual demonstration, had held until this moment. This moment ended it, not because Bruce had done anything aggressive or theatrical, but because the truth of the moment was too specific to be absorbed within the fiction of equality. He had thrown his best combination. It had produced nothing, and in the space it left behind, something had arrived that he hadn't seen coming. The foundation had been examined. What he did with that examination was up to him. He left after 40 minutes. He did not return. But 6 months later, one of his senior students, a young man who had heard his instructor's account of the visit, told privately and without the collegial framing, appeared at the Oakland school and asked to train. He stayed for 2 years. March, April, the challengers kept arriving. A wrestler from Sacramento who had been told that grappling would neutralize Bruce Lee's striking and came to prove it. He lasted 6 minutes before understanding, in his body rather than his mind, why distance management made his grappling entries cost more than they could return. A kung fu practitioner from the Bay Area, northern style, long range, technically beautiful, who came because he had heard that Bruce Lee had abandoned classical Chinese martial arts and wanted to debate it. The debate lasted 20 minutes, the sparring lasted 4, and the kung fu man left with the particular discomfort of someone who has discovered that their argument and their body are not saying the same thing. A former Marine, a tournament champion from San Jose, a Hawaiian kickboxer who had won 11 consecutive fights and whose confidence in his own hitting power was not entirely unjustified. Each one arrived with something. Each one left with less of it than they came with, and strangely, most of them left with more than they arrived with, because what Bruce Lee took from them was not their dignity or their skill or their years of work. He took the comfortable illusion that what they had was complete. And what he gave them in exchange was the question that makes everything else possible. What if there's more? The summer of 1965 brought the most significant challenger of that period. Not the most skilled, not the most physically dangerous, but the most significant, because of who he represented and what his visit meant to the community watching it. His name was Thomas Chen. He was 41 years old. He had trained in traditional Wing Chun, Bruce Lee's original style, the system Ip Man had given him, for 23 years. He was respected in the Chinese martial arts community of the Bay Area with the depth of respect that only time and genuine dedication produce. And he had come to Oakland because what he was hearing about Bruce Lee troubled him in a way that the other challengers' motivations didn't. He wasn't protecting ego. He wasn't testing a rival. He was a senior practitioner of Bruce Lee's own lineage, the tradition Bruce had been born into, trained inside, and was now publicly saying was incomplete. Thomas Chen had given his life to that tradition. He needed to know if Bruce Lee was right.
Not a Tuesday, not a weekend, a Wednesday, a working day, a day when the school ran its normal sessions, and Bruce Lee was not expecting a visitor of any particular significance. Chen came alone. No students, no witnesses from his own community. That choice said something about the nature of his visit. This was not a political act, not a community statement, not the kind of arrival that needed an audience. This was a private inquiry. A man at 41 asking a question he needed answered honestly, without the distortion that witnesses produce. He was compact, quietly built, the kind of physical presence that doesn't announce itself but doesn't yield either. The body of someone who has trained seriously for 23 years and carries that training in the way long-term practitioners do, in the posture and the balance and the particular quality of stillness that develops when the body has been educated past the point of unnecessary movement. He bowed at the door. Bruce Lee bowed back. They sat. They talked first. This was different from the other visits. The wrestlers and the karate men and the tournament fighters had arrived with their bodies, ready to test, ready to establish, the talking secondary to the doing. Thomas Chen arrived with questions. He wanted to understand what Bruce Lee meant when he said that classical Wing Chun was incomplete, not as a challenge, as a genuine inquiry from someone who had practiced it for longer than Bruce Lee had been alive as a martial artist. Bruce Lee answered directly. He said that Wing Chun, their shared inheritance, the system Ip Man had given both of them, though through different generations and different distances, was built on principles that were true. The centerline theory, the economy of motion, the sensitivity training, the simultaneous defense and attack. These were not wrong. They were genuine insights about how human bodies could be organized for combat. But the system had been built for a specific context, a specific range, a specific type of encounter. And when that context changed, when the opponent moved outside the range, when this had been designed to address, the practitioner had two choices.
force the situation back into the system's preferred context, or adapt. Most classical practitioners, Bruce said, chose the first option, without realizing they were choosing, because the system had become identity, not just a set of techniques, but a definition of self, and adapting felt like betrayal. Thomas Chen listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said, "Show me." They stood. What followed was not a challenge match, not sparring in any competitive sense. It was something closer to a conversation conducted in the language of touch, the Qi-Sao sensitivity work that Wing Chun uses as its primary training methodology. Hands in contact, each practitioner feeling the other's intention and responding. Chen was good. This needs to be said clearly, because the story of what happened between them is not the story of an old man discovering his limitations. It is the story of a genuinely skilled practitioner encountering something that his genuine skill could not reach. His sensitivity was real. 23 years of Qi-Sao had given him hands that could feel the shift of weight and intention in another person's body with the accuracy of a precision instrument. His structure was sound. His center line was defended with the automatic, unconscious competence of someone for whom the fundamental habits had long since become reflex. For the first 30 seconds, the exchange was genuinely even. Bruce Lee felt it. Acknowledged it. Not verbally, but in the quality of his engagement. He was not performing against Chen. He was actually working. Then he opened a different gear. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement or escalation of visible energy. Just a shift. A change in the quality of his presence in the exchange that Chen felt before he could identify it. The sensitivity that had been tracking Bruce's intentions suddenly had less to track. Not because Bruce had become less present, but because the gap between his intention forming and his movement executing had compressed to something below the threshold of Chen's ability to read it. The hands that Chen was feeling, reading, interpreting, responding to, were arriving at conclusions before Chen's nervous system could process the premise. He was always one step behind. Not 2 steps. Not dramatically outpaced. 1 step. The most disorienting distance. Close enough to feel like you should be able to close it. Far enough that every attempt to do so produces nothing. Chen tried for 3 minutes. Then he stopped. He stood still, hands at his sides, and did something that none of the previous 11 challengers had done. He closed his eyes. He stood with his eyes closed for almost a full minute. Bruce Lee waited. His 2 students, watching from the side of the room, didn't move. The school was quiet. Outside, the Oakland street made its ordinary noise. Traffic, distant voices. The sound of a city that had no idea what was happening in this room. When Chen opened his eyes, they were different. Not sad. Not defeated. Something more complex than either. The expression of a man who has received difficult information and is choosing consciously and with some effort to receive it as a gift rather than a wound. He said, "How long have you been working on this?" Bruce Lee told him. The month since the Wong-Jack man fight. The systematic dismantling and rebuilding. The training designed specifically to collapse the gap between perception and response. The 1,000 hours aimed at a single millisecond. Chen nodded slowly. "And you believe any practitioner can develop this? Not just someone with your natural gifts?" Bruce Lee's answer was immediate and certain. "Natural gifts determine your ceiling," he said. "The work determines where you actually end up. Most people never find their ceiling because they stop climbing long before they reach it. The system tells them where the walls are. They believe the system." Chen was quiet for a moment. Then, "Ip Man never told me the walls were real." "No," Bruce said. "He didn't tell me either." Chen left after 2 hours. He shook Bruce Lee's hand at the door. Not a bow this time. A handshake. The gesture of a peer rather than a supplicant. He did not come back. But 3 months later, Bruce received a letter. Handwritten. Formal in the way that men of Chen's generation were formal in writing. Even when the content was personal. The letter said that Chen had returned to his school and begun asking his students to attack him in ways his system wasn't designed to handle. That he had spent the first week being worse than he had ever been. That he had spent the second week beginning to understand why. It ended with a single line that Bruce Lee kept. "You did not break what I built. You showed me the door I had been standing in front of without seeing." By the end of 1965, the pattern was visible. 12 challengers. 12 encounters. No formal record. Bruce Lee kept no log of these visits. No scoreboard. No documentation designed for posterity. What documentation exists comes from the witnesses. The students who were present. The challengers themselves who told their own versions in private conversations that eventually found their way into the accounts of people who were paying attention. The pattern was this. They came with a system. They left with a question. And the question, what if what I have is not complete, was more valuable than anything they had arrived with. Because it was the question that opened the door to everything else. The question that Bruce Lee had been living inside since October 1964. when he walked home from a fight he had won and decided that winning wasn't the point. 12 men had now received that question. Some of them were ready for it. Some of them weren't. All of them were changed by it, whether they wanted to be or not.
Not just technique. The technique was already extraordinary by the time the challengers began arriving. What the 14 months of continuous testing built was something underneath the technique, something in the structure of how he understood himself as a practitioner and a teacher. He had been tested repeatedly by real practitioners with real skills in a private room with no audience and no stakes beyond the truth of the exchange. And every test had confirmed the same thing. Not that he was unbeatable. He never claimed to be unbeatable. That kind of claim was, by his own philosophy, a form of the rigidity he was training himself out of. An unbeatable fighter is a fighter who has stopped learning, because learning requires the acknowledgement that there is something you don't yet know. What the tests confirmed was that the direction was right, that the work he had been doing since the Wong Jackman fight, the dismantling of classical assumptions, the rebuilding on the basis of what actually functioned, the compression of the gap between perception and response, was producing something real, something that held up under pressure from genuinely skilled opponents, something that worked not in theory, but in the specific, honest, unforgiving laboratory of a room with another serious practitioner and no script. The direction was right. He pushed harder. The training during this period was extraordinary, even by his own standards. He was running, every morning, regardless of weather, the Oakland streets before dawn, ankle weights after the first month, distances that increased systematically as his body adapted and demanded more. Not for cardiovascular fitness in the general sense, but for the specific endurance that a real fight demands, the ability to maintain full neurological speed and precision when the body is already taxed, when the clean laboratory conditions of fresh training have been replaced by the accumulated cost of effort. He was hitting the wooden dummy every day, the Wing Chun training tool he had inherited from Ip Man, modified and extended with additions of his own design that addressed angles and situations the classical dummy wasn't built to train. His forearms during this period were described by students who trained with him as almost frightening to touch, not large but dense, the tissue changed by years of contact training into something that didn't respond to impact the way normal forearms respond. He was reading. The library was growing. Boxing manuals, fencing texts, wrestling technique books, anatomy, physics, philosophy. He was a practitioner who understood that the body and the mind were not separate instruments, and that what he understood intellectually would eventually find its way into his physical expression, and vice versa. He was writing. The notebooks from this period, some of which have been published, many of which have not, show a mind moving at a speed that the training room could barely contain. Ideas about distance and timing in the psychology of combat, diagrams of positions and angles, philosophical observations that connected the mechanics of fighting to the broader principles of how a human being could organize themselves in relation to a world that was always moving and never cooperative. He was becoming something that the 12 challengers had each encountered a piece of, the speed, the sensitivity, the interception, the complete absence of wasted motion, but that was larger than any single encounter could contain. In 1966, Hollywood called, not metaphorically, the Green Hornet series, a role as Kato, the first time a mass American audience would encounter Bruce Lee in motion. The Oakland years ended not with a final confrontation or a dramatic conclusion, but with the ordinary transition of a life moving into its next chapter. Students were passed to trusted practitioners. The school continued without him. The Broadway space that had hosted 12 challengers and 10,000 training hours went back to being a room. Bruce Lee went to Los Angeles. He took with him everything the Oakland years had built, the tested technique, the confirmed direction, the philosophical clarity that had been sharpened by 14 months of continuous real-world pressure. He took the question that the challengers had each received, and that he had been living inside himself since the night he walked home from San Francisco. What if what I have is not yet complete? He never stopped asking it. That is not a comfortable question to live inside. It produces no resting place, no moment of arrival, no credential that can be hung on a wall and pointed to as evidence that the work is done. It is the question of a man who has chosen growth over comfort and honesty over the consolation of fixed belief. Bruce Lee chose it every day. In the Oakland school against 12 men who came to test him, that choice was made visible. What the challengers found in that room was not a fighter, or not only a fighter. A fighter is a man who has developed his weapons and learned to deploy them. There are many fighters. The world produces them in quantity, talented, trained, dangerous men who have worked their systems to a high level of development and can demonstrate that development under pressure. What the challengers found was something rare. A man who had decided that the weapons were not the point, that the development of the weapons, the continuous, honest, ruthless process of finding and closing every gap between what you are and what you could be, was the actual practice. That the weapons were just the current expression of that process, and the process was what mattered, because the process never ended,
and the weapons were always provisional. The wrestlers and the karate men and Thomas Chen with his 23 years of Wing Chun, they had all arrived with weapons. Bruce Lee arrived every day with the process. That was the difference. That was what 12 serious practitioners had encountered in a bare room in Oakland and carried home with them and spent the rest of their lives trying to name. The footage from Oakland doesn't exist. No cameras, no documentation, just a room and the people who were in it, and the accounts that moved outward from those people into the community, and the community into the wider world, carrying the shape of something that had happened without anyone deciding to record it. The truth doesn't need to be recorded to be true. It needs to be tested. Oakland was the test. And the test held, not because Bruce Lee was invincible, but because the thing he was building was real, built on honest foundations, confirmed by real pressure from real practitioners who had no reason to protect his reputation and every reason to expose any gap in it. They found no gap. They found a question. And the question, carried outward by 12 men into the world, became the beginning of everything that came after. The water metaphor is almost too familiar now. 50 years of repetition have worn the edges smooth. Be like water has become a poster, a meme, a piece of motivational shorthand stripped of the specific, hard-won meaning Bruce Lee packed into it. But in Oakland in 1965, against a judoka on a Tuesday afternoon and a Wing Chun elder on a Wednesday morning, and 10 other serious men in between, the metaphor was not a saying. It was a demonstration. Water has no shape of its own. It takes the shape of whatever contains it. It flows around every obstacle without deciding to flow. It finds every opening without planning to find it. It cannot be gripped because it has nothing to grip. It cannot be stopped because it has no form to stop. Every challenger who reached for Bruce Lee in that room reached for water, and found exactly what water always offers. Nothing to hold. Everything to learn. If you've stayed this long, you already know why. Because this channel is not about the myth. The myth is easy. The myth is the poster on the wall and the famous quote and the cultural icon whose face travels across 50 years without aging. This channel is about the room. The bare floor. The real opponent. The moment before anyone was watching, when the only thing that mattered was whether what you had built actually held up against something that refused to cooperate. Bruce Lee lived in that room. Every day of his life, he went back to that room. And what he built there, tested against 12 men who came to break it, confirmed by the most honest laboratory available to any practitioner, is still standing. Subscribe. Because next week we go back to the room. We always go back to the room. That's where the real story lives.